June 6th, 1944. Normandy, France. D-Day. American paratroopers from the 506th Infantry Regiment landed behind enemy lines. Their mission: secure Utah Beach before the main invasion force arrived. In the chaos of gunfire and explosions, they stormed a German bunker. Inside, they expected to find Nazi soldiers. Instead, they found something that made absolutely no sense. An Asian man in a German uniform who didn't speak German or English or French. The Americans were convinced he was Japanese. Why else would an Asian man be fighting for Hitler? They took him prisoner. They labeled him as a Japanese collaborator. They had no idea they'd just captured the only man in history to fight for 3 different armies in the same war. This is his story. To understand Yang Kyoungjong's impossible journey, we have to go back to where it all began. 1938, Korea. Yang Kyoungjong was 18 years old, a farmer's son in a small village near the Manchurian border. He had no interest in war, no interest in politics. He wanted to farm, get married, live quietly. But Korea wasn't independent. Japan had occupied the country since 1910. For nearly 3 decades, Korea existed under Japanese imperial rule. Korean culture was suppressed. The Korean language was banned in schools. Even Korean names were forcibly changed to Japanese names. And now, as Japan's war machine expanded across Asia, they needed soldiers. In 1938, Japan introduced conscription in Korea. They called it volunteer service, but there was nothing voluntary about it. Japanese military police went village to village, rounding up young Korean men. Yang Kyoungjong was one of them. He said goodbye to his family. He had no idea he wouldn't see Korea again for 6 years, or that he'd be forced to fight for 3 different countries before he could go home. Yang was sent to Manchuria, northeastern China. He became part of the Kwantung Army, Japan's million-strong force occupying Manchuria. For Yang, it was hell. He didn't speak Japanese fluently. He was treated as inferior by Japanese officers. Korean conscripts were given the worst duties, the most dangerous assignments, the least respect. But Yang kept his head down. He followed orders. He survived. Until 1939, when everything changed. Japan and the Soviet Union had been skirmishing along the Mongolian-Manchurian border for months. Small fights, border disputes, nothing serious. Then, in May 1939, it exploded into full-scale war, the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. One of the largest tank battles in history. 75,000 Japanese and Manchukuoan troops versus 57,000 Soviet and Mongolian forces. Yang's unit was sent to the front lines. He'd never experienced combat like this. Soviet tanks rolled across the steppes. Artillery shells turned the earth into craters. Men died by the thousands. Yang watched friends vanish in explosions. He saw soldiers burned alive. He fired his rifle at shapes in the distance and prayed he wouldn't die in this foreign land fighting someone else's war. August 1939. The Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. They encircled the Japanese forces. Yang's unit was trapped. He had 2 choices: fight to the death or surrender to the Red Army. Yang chose to live. He raised his hands and became a Soviet prisoner of war. He thought the war was over for him. He was wrong. It had only just begun. Soviet POW camps were brutal. Starvation, disease, forced labor in sub-zero temperatures. Thousands of Japanese prisoners died in the first months. But Yang had something most prisoners didn't. He wasn't Japanese. He was Korean. He was a conscript. He'd been forced to fight. The Soviets didn't see him as an enemy. They saw him as a victim of Japanese imperialism. And more importantly, they saw him as useful. 1939 turned into 1940. Stalin's Red Army was expanding rapidly. They needed soldiers, lots of them. And if you could hold a rifle, you could serve. Yang was given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Join the Red Army or stay in the prison camp and probably die. He put on a Soviet uniform. He learned basic Russian commands. He was assigned to a labor battalion on the Western Front. For the second time in 2 years, Yang Kyoungjong was fighting for an army he never chose. June 22, 1941. Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border. Yang's labor battalion was in the Western Soviet Union when the Germans attacked. They weren't frontline combat troops, but it didn't matter. The Germans were advancing so fast that everyone became frontline troops. Yang found himself in the chaos of the Eastern Front, the most brutal theater of World War II, where 27 million Soviet citizens would die, where entire cities were reduced to rubble, where surrender often meant execution. He dug trenches. He hauled supplies. He helped build defensive positions as the Germans pushed closer and closer to Moscow. And then, in the winter of 1941, his unit was surrounded. The German 6th Army encircled Soviet positions near the Ukrainian border. Yang's battalion was trapped. They fought for 3 days, with dwindling ammunition and no reinforcements. On the 4th day, German tanks rolled through their position. Yang's commanding officer ordered them to surrender. For the second time in the war, Yang Kyoungjong raised his hands as a prisoner. The Germans marched them west. Thousands of Soviet POWs stumbling through the snow. Many collapsed from exhaustion. The Germans shot anyone who couldn't keep walking. Yang survived the march. He arrived at a German POW camp in Poland. He thought maybe, finally, the war would leave him alone. Maybe he could just survive in the camp until the war ended. But the Germans had other plans. The German war machine was stretching thin. By 1942, they were fighting on multiple fronts. They needed soldiers, urgently. They started forming volunteer battalions from Soviet prisoners of war. They called them Ostlegionen, Eastern Legions. The Germans promised better food, better treatment, and a chance to survive. The alternative was staying in the camp and starving to death. Yang didn't speak German. He didn't believe Nazi ideology. He didn't want to fight for them, but he wanted to live. For the third time, Yang Kyoungjong put on another uniform, German field gray. He was assigned to an Ost battalion, a unit made up primarily of Soviet POWs from Central Asia and the Caucasus. They were sent to France to defend Hitler's Atlantic Wall against an Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. Yang spent 2 years on the French coast, building bunkers, laying mines, scanning the horizon for ships that would eventually come. He learned bits of German. He learned bits of French from local civilians. He kept his head down. He tried not to think about home, about Korea, about the life he'd lost. And then, June 6th, 1944 arrived. The largest amphibious invasion in history. 156,000 Allied troops storming the beaches of Normandy. Yang's unit was stationed inland from Utah Beach. They weren't on the beach itself. That was reserved for actual German troops. The Ost battalions were second-line defense, but D-Day was chaos. Paratroopers landed behind German lines. Allied bombers destroyed communications. Units got separated. Orders contradicted each other. Yang's bunker was attacked by American paratroopers from the 506th Infantry Regiment. They stormed in with guns raised, expecting a firefight. Instead, they found Yang and a handful of other Ost Battalion soldiers who immediately surrendered. They were exhausted. They were terrified. They had no loyalty to Germany. The Americans were confused. They'd never seen Asian soldiers fighting for the Germans. They assumed Yang was Japanese, an Axis ally fighting alongside the Nazis. Yang tried to explain. Through broken German and hand gestures, he tried to tell them Korea, Manchuria, Soviet Union, forced, prisoner, no choice. The Americans didn't understand. They saw an enemy combatant in a German uniform. They took him prisoner. For the fourth time in the war, Yang Kyoungjong was captured. The Americans transferred Yang to a POW camp in Britain. Military intelligence interrogated him. They brought in translators, Japanese, Russian, eventually Korean. Slowly, impossibly, Yang's story came out. Conscripted by Japan, captured by Soviets, conscripted by Soviets, captured by Germans, conscripted by Germans, captured by Americans. One man, 4 captures, 3 different armies, 6 years of war. The interrogators couldn't believe it. They checked and double-checked his story. They looked for inconsistencies, but everything checked out. Yang Kyoungjong had fought for Japan against the Soviets. He'd fought for the Soviets against the Germans. He'd fought for the Germans against the Americans. He'd never chosen any of it. The Americans realized he wasn't a war criminal. He wasn't a collaborator. He was a victim. A man swept up in forces completely beyond his control. They reclassified him from enemy POW to displaced person. And finally, after 6 years of war, Yang Kyoungjong's fighting was over. 1945. World War II ended. The camps emptied. Soldiers went home. But where was home for Yang Kyoungjong? Korea was divided. The north occupied by Soviets. The south occupied by Americans. The country was in chaos. Families were separated. The infrastructure was destroyed. Yang had no idea if his family was alive. He had no money, no connections, no way to get back to Korea easily. He stayed in the displaced persons camps in Europe. He worked odd jobs. He learned English. He waited. 1947, 2 years after the war ended. Finally, Yang managed to get passage back to Asia. He returned to Korea. His village was gone. His family was scattered. The Korea he remembered didn't exist anymore. The country he'd been forced to leave as a teenager was now split in two by the Cold War. Yang tried to rebuild, but he was a stranger in his own country. He'd been gone for 9 years. He'd missed his entire 20s. He didn't fit anywhere. In 1951, Yang made a decision. Korea was about to explode into another war, the Korean War. He'd already fought in one world war for 3 different armies. He wasn't going to fight in another. He emigrated to the United States, specifically to Illinois. He settled down. He got married. He worked in a factory. He lived quietly, and he never talked about the war. His neighbors didn't know his story. His co-workers didn't know his story. He'd been forced to fight for Japan, Russia, and Germany. He'd been captured 4 times. He'd survived one of the most improbable journeys in military history, and he wanted to forget all of it. Yang Kyoungjong died in 1992. He was 72 years old. He'd lived a quiet, peaceful life in America. He'd finally found the peace he'd been searching for since 1938. Yang Kyoungjong's story is almost impossible to believe. But it's true. He represents something we often forget about war. The millions of ordinary people swept up in extraordinary circumstances. People who never wanted to fight. People who just wanted to live. He was Korean, but fought for Japan. He was a prisoner, but fought for the Soviets. He was forced to serve Germany. He was liberated by America. 4 captures, 3 armies. One man who never chose any of it. His story wasn't discovered until the 1990s, when a South Korean filmmaker researched Asian soldiers in the German army. Even then, it took years to piece together Yang's full journey. There's a famous photograph from D-Day, an Asian man in a German uniform, looking confused and exhausted, surrounded by American soldiers. For decades, historians thought he was Japanese. That photograph might be Yang Kyoungjong. We'll never know for certain. But we know his story. We know what he endured. We know he survived. Yang Kyoungjong represents every soldier who was forced to fight in wars they didn't start, for causes they didn't believe in countries they'd never heard of. He's a reminder that war doesn't just kill. It displaces. It tears apart lives. It forces impossible choices on ordinary people. And sometimes, against all odds, those people survive. This is the Forgotten Front, where we tell the stories history almost forgot. If you want to hear more stories like Yang's, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what forgotten story you want to hear next.